Hi, everybody. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'll just wait for the numbers to trickle up a bit. Do introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you're dialing in from. Let's have a look. Oops. I can see the numbers creeping up. Looks like we're from all over the world today. That's wonderful. We've got France, Berlin, Netherlands, Israel, Italy, Virginia. This is fab. Well, welcome everybody. I'll quickly introduce myself before we kind of dive in to this interesting question. I think I've really unpicked this for us today. Why do we fortified wine? My name's Anjali. I am a wine educator at the WSET School in London, and I've been tasked today with kind of really trying to understand why we fortified wine, as well as I'm going to kind of give you a overview of a few kind of key styles that you can start exploring. Before we get into it, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A box. I will check in with that at the end of the webinar. This is being recorded and will be uploaded onto the WSET Global Events Hub on YouTube, so you can watch it later on at your leisure. So I think firstly, in order to answer the question of why do we fortify wine, I think we need to first ask ourselves, what is fortified wine? So I thought it'd be best to kind of have a look at the definition of this first, and we can use that information to then kind of understand why this style of wine exists. So put very simply, fortified wine is wine that has had additional alcohol added to it. And this additional alcohol is usually in the form of what we may kind of recognize as a spirit. So it is alcohol that is distilled and is most of the time derived from grapes. So you can kind of think of it as a grape brandy. Sometimes the alcohol that is used to fortify wine is so strong that it may be more kind of recognizable as a vodka. But certainly not one that you might want to drink really, really high strength. And we'll kind of dive into the different ways you might be able to fortify wine when we look at some different styles. So why do we fortify wine? Now, I've really thought about this in hopefully kind of a few different perspectives, and I've kind of come up with 4 key reasons why we fortify wine, though I think some a little bit more important or kind of notable than others. So firstly, we fortify wine in order to preserve it. Now, in lots of ways, this is the most kind of important reason that fortified wine exists. At least historically, preserving the wine has been the kind of fundamental as to why we still know and still enjoy these wines today. They have a kind of long history, in the root of that history being that they were designed to be preserved for a prolonged period of time. The other kind of effects of fortifying wine are that we're going to have new aromas and flavors develop in the wine. We're also then going to end up with a wine that may be more complex, and we're going to increase the body of that wine as well. So we're going to look into each of these reasons and kind of dive into them in a bit more detail. Firstly, preserving the wine. Alcohol, especially high strength alcohol, is an antiseptic and an antimicrobial. In other words, it will preserve a wine and protect it from spoilage. So the roots of a lot of fortified wine styles come from the kind of more practical consideration that the wine needed to be preserved for a prolonged period of time to make its way long distances overseas. I'm thinking back to a time when we didn't have all of the kind of high-tech preservation techniques we do today. It's much less of a kind of important consideration, or at least we have now found solutions that don't require fortification. But these styles have kind of existed and retained in our life today with the root being that they needed to be preserved. Now, the effect of this is that we may get some new aromas and flavours in our wine. Firstly, aromas and flavours derive from the spirit itself. So the liquid, the distilled spirit that we use to fortify the wine, may add its own character into that final wine. So this may come through as a slightly kind of more spicy, medicinal, sometimes people pick it up as kind of herbal aroma coming through. Alternatively, sometimes there are categories of fortified wines that botanicals, so I'm thinking things like herbs and spices, may have been macerated in, and those will impart their own individual aromas and flavours. Finally, we may kind of, as a byproduct in a way of the practice of fortifying a wine, you may then wish to allow that wine to age for some time. And that's so that the spirit can start to taste better integrated into the final wine. And the wine sort of tastes like one whole thing. And in that sense, if you're going to be aging your wine for a prolonged period of time, you may then develop tertiary characteristics. So these are aromas like caramel or toasted nuts, or sometimes a kind of a leathery quality. So if we think about all of these kind of different layers into a fortified wine, it means that these wines can end up being particularly complex. Now, the list of aromas and flavours here, where they're derived from, may not exist in every fortified wine, but high quality fortified wines may include flavours that are largely derived from either the base wine itself, the character of the spirit that you're then going to add into that fortified wine, from deliberate aging, so these are those tertiary characteristics, things like that kind of caramel and those nuts, or botanicals, so herbs and spices that we then macerate into the wine. Now, it's important to say that not all fortified wines will contain aromas derived from all of these things, but some of them will, and some of them will contain more than one of those things. And then we start to develop these kind of layers of complexity into our final wine. The final kind of effect of fortifying a wine is that we're then going to increase the body of the wine. Now, this is one of those words that's really kind of commonly used when we're talking about wine, but what does it really mean? I mean, I think the best way to think about body is to think about the weight of the wine on your palate. So how kind of thick and full and heavy it feels when you're tasting it. You think about drinking some lemonade compared to drinking some mango juice. This is a good kind of a couple of good examples that may show how different the kind of the liquid feels on your palate. And we can attribute this to various different wines as well. Now, the act of adding additional alcohol to a wine is going to increase your perception of body in that wine. The wine is going to then taste fuller bodied. What can also happen with fortified wine, or relatively commonly, fortified wines also contain some sweetness. Now, it's kind of a whole webinar in and of itself to have a think about how and why fortified wines contain sweetness. But the effect of fortified wines that do have sweetness in them is that that will also increase the body of a wine. More sugar in your wine will have a similar effect. It will increase the weight and texture and body of that wine. So that's another kind of effect of the process of fortifying a wine. Now, these are the kind of tools that I really wanted to cover so that we could then have a look at some specific examples, because I think that's when these styles really come to life and we really start to understand why we fortify wine and what some of these styles can taste like. I guess importantly also the diversity of styles of fortified wine. It's not just one style. It's in fact a really difficult category to define. So I think examples is the best way to go. So I've got a few here. Firstly, potentially quite a well-known style, vintage port. So vintage port is a full-bodied style of fortified wine. It's red, it's sweet, and it has aromas of stewed black fruits and spice. It smells very Christmassy to me. Where do we find port? We find it in the Douro Valley in Portugal. And port is made up, the wine we use to make port is made up of a blend of several different black grape varieties Notably, a grape variety called Touriga Nacional, but it's very common in this part of the world to blend different grape varieties together. So you can quite readily expect the wine that's used in vintage port to be a blend of different varieties, Touriga Nacional really being one of the most important. One of the key things that stands vintage port apart, and port in general, is that it's fortified with a spirit that's actually not that strong in the scheme of things. So the liquid we use to fortify port is called aguardente, and sort of loosely translates, I believe, to fire water. And it is pretty strong. It's 77% ABV. And in the scheme of things, this is actually slightly lower strength alcohol, and that spirit actually has some character, some aroma, and some flavour of itself. So by adding this aguardente to our wine, a couple of things happen. Firstly, we stop the process of fermentation, which was taking place within that grape juice. This means the yeast is no longer going to be able to convert all of the sugar from those Touriga Nacional grapes into alcohol. This means we trap in sweetness into our port. Port is a sweet wine. And in addition to that, it has aromas and flavors that are derived from this aguardente. And this can kind of come through as kind of slightly herbal, medicinal, and almost a slightly kind of spirity quality to the wine. Vintage port is also quite high in alcohol. 19 to 22% ABV is what you can expect in the final wine. And even within the category of fortified wine, this is on the higher side. So you can often pick up that alcohol quite explicitly on the palate, and even sometimes on the nose as you're swirling your glass of vintage port. So that's one key style. We're going to look at an entirely different style now, and that is Fino Sherry. So sherry, another important style of fortified wine. Sherry is dry, and it's a white wine, and it's got some really complex and interesting aromas. We're thinking things like bruised apple, green olive, bread dough, aromas that might be kind of almost smell a little bit like the sea. So things like seaweed, iodine, things like that. We are down in the south of Spain, and our grape variety is called Palomino. This is the grape variety used to make the wine that is later fortified. And part of the kind of complexity and the interest in Fino Sherry is actually not really derived from that base wine. The character of our Palomino is, in lots of ways, you can kind of see it as a blank canvas upon which we're going to build layers of flavour. Those layers of flavour also aren't really derived from the liquid that we're going to use to fortify. You can see here we're at a much stronger grape spirit. 95% is used to raise the total level of alcohol to somewhere between 15 and 15.5%. Now, I've done a little asterisk here because as of relatively recently, it's no longer essential for Fino Sherry producers to use this spirit to raise up the level of alcohol in their wine if they can achieve a level of 15% naturally just by fermenting grape juice as we would a non-fortified wine. But I think it's still helpful to consider Fino Sherry as a fortified wine. We're going to be adding this 95% grape spirit to our dry Palomino wine, and we probably won't need very much. Just a little bit to nudge that level of alcohol up to 15%. The true character of Fino Sherry is going to come from maturation under a thin layer of living yeast. And again, really all of these styles could have their own webinar completely dedicated to them. They are so kind of complex and fascinating. So just to kind of really briefly give an overview of this style of sherry, the living yeast at the top will protect the rest of the wine in the barrel from oxygen, but it will impart its own aromas and flavors. And that's why Fino Sherry can often have this really interesting kind of bread dough aroma to it, as well as these other quite complex aromas, this bruised apple and this green olive and this kind of saline, almost saline quality. Fino Sherry and vintage port, I really believe despite the fact that they're in the same category of being fortified wines, they could not taste more different from each other. So it's worth getting the opportunity to taste both of those. Even if you can do it kind of next to each other, you see just how different wines that are categorized together can taste. They are worlds and worlds apart. And I'm going to add in now a few more different styles of fortified wine. So our next one is called Muscat de Baume de Venise. And this is a fortified wine with another entirely different perspective. So this is a sweet white wine. And the aromas you find in Muscat de Baume de Venise include aromas of blossom, grape, peach, this real kind of floral, perfumed, aromatic wine. And I think this is a really interesting style of fortified wine to show, because it also shows that fortified wine quite readily exists where actually the base wine is the most important part of the character of that final drink. With lots of fortified wines that we know about, and I'll continue to explore, the aromas and flavors we expect are maybe from aging or from that spirit, but not necessarily just from that base wine. But Muscat de Baume de Venise is quite different in the sense that it smells a lot like a sweet Muscat wine. If you've tasted one of those before, this will have really similar qualities. It's designed to be consumed kind of young and fresh and perfumed. And that fortification spirit, that liquid will just be bumping the level of alcohol up. So it'll taste fuller in body. You may be able to pick up that warming effect from the alcohol a little bit better. But otherwise, the aromas you can expect are aromas that are derived from that base wine. So a kind of different way to consider a fortified wine, or what we maybe have preconceived ideas of a fortified wine being. Our next example is Madeira. And I've gone for a specific style of Madeira, as I have with the rest of the wines that I'm using as examples. So maybe you can seek them out, find out a little bit more about them, or find out about what other styles of fortified wine you can get your hands on. Cercial Madeira relates to the grape variety used in the production of this wine. So Cercial is the name of the grape variety. Madeira is the name of the wine and also the name of the region where the wine is from. And this is an island quite far off the coast of mainland Portugal. It's a volcanic island, and I've had the pleasure of visiting, and it is so incredible flying into Madeira, because the land almost feels like it's vertically shot up from the sea. It's just an incredible place to just kind of witness or see images of. And the grapes here are grown on these very steep slopes. Cercial is quite a challenging grape to grow, but it produces wine with incredibly high acidity, and that's a really important part of the character of Madeira made from Cercial, and Madeira in general. We can expect a high level of acidity here. That kind of razor sharp acidity is combined with these aromas of things like citrus peel and this nuttiness. And we have a relatively high strength fortified wine here, 19 to 20%. Cercial Madeira is one of the drier styles of Madeira that you can find. So though you may be able to detect some sugar on the palate, it's certainly not as sweet as, for example, that Muscat de Baume de Venise we've just looked at, or vintage port. And in that sense, it's quite common to serve Cercial Madeira as an aperitif, nicely chilled with some kind of nuts or nibbles before a meal, because it's got all of that acidity to kind of make your mouth water and get ready for a lovely meal. Our next fortified wine is a aromatized wine. So it's not only fortified with distilled alcohol, as all of our other ones have been, but this wine has also been aromatized. And by that, I mean botanicals have been macerated into this wine. So ingredients that are not derived from grapes have been used to make this wine. And if you're interested in learning more about lots of these categories, a lot of them feature on our WSET qualifications. Vermouth, interestingly, appears in our spirits qualifications because of just how important it is in cocktail culture and in spirits culture more generally. And Vermouth de Torino is one of the few vermouths that has a kind of protected geographical designation. So it needs to come from Piedmont in Italy. The wine used to make Vermouth de Torino needs to be a white wine from Piemonte as well. So for example, something like Cortese, you may know that grape variety a little bit better if you are a wine fan from wines like Gavi. And very importantly, with this style of wine, the botanicals macerated in need to predominantly contain wormwood. You may know of wormwood by also being a key aroma constituent of absinthe as well. And that will also bring bitterness to the drink, alongside this quite balanced sweetness in Vermouth de Torino. You can have this neat, or it's very common to use in a variety of different cocktails, including lots of different Negronis. Very delicious it is too. Our final key style of fortified wine specifically is called Marsala. I've gone for Marsala Oro. So Oro means gold. And so Marsala Oro needs to have this golden appearance. And that golden appearance is, at least in part, because Marsala Oro needs to be sweetened with grape must. By grape must, I essentially mean grape juice. And this is as opposed to a grape juice that has been cooked down and concentrated, which can be used for other Marsalas. We are in Marsala in Sicily, and the grapes used to produce Marsala are largely local varietals that exist in Sicily. You may be familiar with some of these already. And our final ABV is somewhere kind of in the middle, in the scheme of the strengths of different fortified wines. So we're around 18 to 20%. I think it's important to say Marsala is not just for cooking. A lot of people think, oh, Marsala, I'm going to use that to cook and make my chicken or whatever. It exists as a beautiful, complex and really lovely style of fortified wine. It's a little bit tricky to find, certainly in the UK, but definitely worth seeking out. The final kind of area I really wanted to touch on when thinking about this webinar was, I guess, some lesser known styles, and that led me to the kind of really quite niche subcategory of fortified must. So when I say fortified must, this is not quite the same as a fortified wine, because a fortified wine requires a wine to be made, at least in part, fermentation to start to take place in our grape juice. So some alcohol to start to be created in a way that you would make any kind of still light wine. Fortified must, on the other hand, essentially takes grape juice. Potentially some fermentation may start, but largely we're just going to fortify that. We're going to add a load of spirit to our grape juice, otherwise known as must. Can also be known as mistel or mistella. Now, because we're going to be starting with something that has if 0% alcohol, then a very low level of alcohol, we're going to probably need to use a fair amount of spirit to fortify this drink. So that spirit can become even more important part of the kind of character of fortified musts. And I've got a few examples that, if you're interested in kind of learning a bit more or tasting some of this relatively, well, pretty niche category, I'd encourage you to kind of seek out. So I've got 3 here. Pinot de Charente and Mac Van de Jura are both from France. Pinot de Charente is from Western France. Mac Van de Jura is from the Jura in Eastern France. And these both use must, so grape juice. Mac Van de Jura is fortified with a pomace brandy. So this is really a byproduct of wine production. When I say pomace brandy, this is something that you may know as grappa. Grappa is a pomace brandy, and it is only using the skins of grapes. So after you've squeezed out the liquid from your grapes and you're making your wine, you may have this byproduct of grape skins. And commonly in parts of Italy, you may choose to make grappa from this. In the case of Mac van der Jura, you'll take your pomace brandy left over from the grape skins of the red or white wine that you are making, and you will fortify that with something that a fruit brandy, so a otherwise known as an eau de vie. Pinot de Charente is from Western France, and you're essentially going to be adding kind of cognac to a grape juice. Sounds like quite a delicious cocktail to me. I haven't had the pleasure of trying Pinot de Charente before, but I have tried Mac van der Jura, and that character of the spirit really does come through and add this additional layer of kind of interest and complexity. The final style of fortified must that I thought I can't not include this is called Buckfast. I've got an image of it up here. There we go. Iconic bottle, iconic label. This is a fortified must or mistella that is not only fortified with alcohol, but is also fortified with caffeine. Yikes. And those of you interested in finding out a little bit more about Buckfast, I can tell you that National Buckfast Day is the 2nd Saturday in May. So we've sadly just missed it, but put it in your calendars for next year. This is not considered, none of these are considered technically wines, as they aren't derived from wine, they're derived from grape juice. But I think an interesting subcategory to explore. So that was my whistle-stop tour of a variety of different fortified wines and the styles that you may expect. I hope you've kind of seen just how diverse this category is and how kind of each of these styles really would warrant their own kind of rabbit hole of investigation and kind of tasting in and of themselves. So I hope I've given you a little bit of food for thought and some ideas about what to taste and what to kind of seek out. So thank you so much. I can see that we do have a few questions in the chat. I'm just going to pull them up now. So let me just have a look. I've got a question from Dinesh. Can one make fortified wine at home with the available wine? I mean, you can give it a go. Really, in its kind of bare form, it is relatively straightforward, and that fortified wine is really wine that has had additional alcohol added to it. I don't know how delicious it will taste, because part of the kind of key with fortified wine is making sure that that spirit tastes really nice and well integrated into the rest of the wine. I've got a question from Greg. What should level 2 students focus on for sherry? A really good question. Make sure you've really got your head around the key styles of sherry. So we've touched on one here, which is Fino, but hopefully if you've had a look through your book, you'll see that there are some other key styles of sherry, as well as the terminology that's pretty specifically associated with sherry. I think those are really important words to start to associate with the category and taste them. I think that's always good revision. Okay. Question from Richard, please could you expand on botanicals? Yes, it's quite a broad term. So in the case of vermouth, the most important botanical is wormwood, but botanicals can include things like herbs, spices, citrus peels. It's quite a broad term. Okay. A question from Rajveer on fortified must. So really the definition of must is grape juice. So that's where it's a kind of point of difference from fortified wine. We're going to be adding spirit to a grape juice. Okay, I think that is about time. Thank you so much for joining me at this webinar. And that just leaves me to say goodbye. Thank you so much.